Hello, fellow students of Jewish history. I hope you're doing well. Today is a very important day in my personal calendar. This is the Yortzeit of my father of blessed memory. This is the death anniversary. And I try to do something special every year to mark this date. For the last several years, I've been actually rewriting a particular book. This is it here, Maimonides on Teshuvah, Maimonides on the ways of repentance. And I'd like to talk a little bit more at the end of this video about that and about my father. But what I'd like to focus on in this video is specifically a fascinating individual named Rabbi Leone da Modena, who was especially associated with the city of Venice in the 17th century. He's a fascinating individual that was extremely brilliant, extremely talented, but challenged with an ongoing addiction to gambling, which he wrote about significantly in his rather unusual autobiography, in which he describes his ongoing difficulties with this personal issue. So let's talk a little bit about his life and then focus in a bit on his problem with gambling and try to understand what that has to do with Jewish history overall. His biographical stats are he was born in the year 1571 and he passed away in 1648. His name, as it implies, suggests that his family originally came from Modena, but Leone himself was especially associated with Venice. He was born there, and he spent almost his entire life there, although he did wander around the Po River Valley and went down to Ferrara and so on. Now, fascinatingly, he was a child prodigy. Even as a toddler, he was already translating from Hebrew into Italian, and he was noted for his scholastic skills as a child. In fact, one of the texts that will eventually come to haunt him, the very first thing that he wrote that was later published and actually republished a few times, was an interesting little treatise called Sur Me Ra, which means turn from evil. It's a quote of a verse from Psalms, which was specifically attacking the evils of, you guessed it, gambling. That is, when he was a 12 or 13-year-old boy, he already wrote this book, Sur Me Ra, which is a dialogue between Eldad and Medad, figures in the Bible who discuss the dangers of gambling, and that's where he stakes his position. This would, later be so ironic, but let's get to that shortly. Perhaps his most famous book, however, is this one here, The History of Hebrew Rites, which is essentially kind of like an introduction to Judaism, which was sort of published without his knowledge and nearly got him into trouble. He wrote this book, and it was circulated in Western Europe, particularly in France and in England, where it was extremely popular, and then someone went and published it without his knowledge in Paris. When he heard that this was actually published, that his manuscript was turned into, something that was circulating much more widely, he was very afraid because he had spoken quite openly about his attitude towards the Catholic Church and some of its attitudes towards Jews in particular, and he was deeply concerned that perhaps the Inquisition would get a hold of this and then he would be in a great amount of trouble. So he went right away to the censor and then tried to preempt any problems by suggesting, telling them the story. But then when the book actually appeared, it appeared that his French editor had actually had the foresight to remove a lot of the offending passages from the original manuscript, and so it was actually even published in Venice in 1638. Have a look, by the way, at his picture here. You can see that he's shown here clearly bareheaded, which is fascinating. You can assume this was published in his lifetime, so you would think that would be more or less a faithful reproduction of his visage. I wonder if he was portrayed as bareheaded because he chose to appear that way, or perhaps it was more of a suggestion of the author or the title page, the artist himself. I don't know. So, what about his talents? He was a brilliant scholar, writing many important works that have survived and have been republished many times to this day. He was a very, very talented orator. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. And he was a respected, if not necessarily enthusiastic, teacher. Towards the end of his life, he was bouncing around from one teaching position to another and not especially satisfied with the job as a whole. In fact, he recorded at one point 23 different occupations that he had in his lifetime. You have to imagine in 17th century Venice, the gift of speaking was especially valuable. In fact, his speeches were frequently attended by foreign dignitaries, even churchmen, who would come to the ghetto specifically to hear this famous rabbi speak. One particular incident stands out. In 1616, Rabbi Salomone Seforno passed away. He was a friend of Rabbi Leone da Yehuda, and so the rabbi made a eulogy of his friend, and in particular made an appeal for support for Rabbi Seforno's unmarried daughter. Within a very short period of time, 500 ducats were raised. That's really quite an impressive amount. Later on, Leone happened to overhear a speech by a priest in the church of San Geremia. That's also kind of interesting. Like, what is Rabbi Leone doing in a church listening to a public speech? It's part of the, kind of environment of Venice in the 17th century. This was an extremely, it's a little late for the Renaissance, but it's sort of like a period of tremendous overlapping and experimentation in many ways of Jewish practices and sensibilities, which caused not a little amount of stress, but that's not for this particular video. And after all, if churchmen are coming to hear the rabbi speak in synagogue, it only stands to reason that you would have the rabbis come to the church to listen to the priest. We'll talk more about that in a second. At any rate, when Rabbi Leone da Modena went to this church and heard the priest speak, the priest was talking about how amazing it is that the Jews are so charitable that they can have one speaker get up, a very talented speaker, and can raise 500 ducats within a short period of time. And in fact, the priest noticed the rabbi sitting in the audience and pointed him out with praise. So this just gives you some sense of how skilled he was as an orator. Now, so here we have this brilliant rabbi, great scholar, great speaker, teaching all over the place. What about this gambling problem? So we know about it principally from his own testimony, from an autobiography he wrote called Chaye Yehuda. Here you can see the actual manuscript, the cover page in Rabbi Leone's own hand. This is arguably the very first autobiography written, at least in modern times, by a rabbi. It predates Rabbi Yaakov Emden's remarkable autobiography as well, but in many ways it's just as spicy. The dominant theme of this autobiography are the struggles that Rabbi Leone has to go through, specifically because of his problem with gambling. We should recall that the ghetto has a highly artificial economy. According to the charters that were issued, the condotte in Venice, Jews were only allowed to engage in money lending or in second-hand sales, meaning second-hand clothing, second-hand furniture, second-hand mattresses, whatever you can name, that's what they would have to sell second-hand. And there were also a couple of small carve-outs, like, for example, for Jewish doctors or Jewish proofreaders, copy editors for the printing industry, and so on. So that meant that there was a lot of underground economic activity happening that maybe we'll talk about in another video. Rabbi Leone, because of his challenge with gambling, which was rife in Venice and northern Italy at this time in general, he frequently had this kind of like hills and valleys of personal financial stress. He would write a new book, made a ton of money, and then within a period of months, he would lose it all to gambling. Sometimes he would actually make a profit with gambling, but then in a very short period of time, as he describes in his autobiography, he would lose that as well. He engaged in all kinds of various get-rich-quick schemes, including alchemy, right, where it was still quite active in the 17th century to try and create precious metals out of dross or out of like poor metals, base metals. He apparently had initially some success where he created 10 units of silver out of one, but he could not repeat this particular feat. And in fact, it's very tragic. I won't go into his personal life, but he lost one of his sons to apparent chemical poisoning as a result of being involved with these, strange experiments that all involve mercury and other kinds of toxic chemicals. So he would go from like having lots of money and then losing it in gambling, and then getting involved in something else to make a lot more money quickly, and then back again. And this was basically the course of his entire life. Perhaps the low point was when in 1630, oh, and by the way, his wages were even garnished to pay for the losses that he had suffered. But in 1630, this was definitely the low point. The community leaders, the Jewish community leaders in Venice, made a blanket ban against gambling, because this was not only his problem, it was one that was rife in society at that time. And they placed a ban that anyone who engaged in gambling would be excommunicated. And Leone actually went and led the charge against the ban. He argued, for example, that the leadership of the community, since it was based on a certain amount of property holding that gave people the right to elect members of the leadership, it was not sufficiently democratic in order to pass a ban on the entire community. He argued as well that there was no specific ban in the Torah that would justify excommunicating anyone who engaged in gambling. It was all for naught. He was not able to convince the leadership to change their position. What a shame that this person who had railed against it in his youth later was so deeply enmeshed in gambling that he ended up really disgracing himself with this last-ditch effort to try and protect his personal addiction. There's one other fascinating passage in his autobiography that was the source of some scandal afterwards as well. Rabbi Leone describes how in the year 1622, an anonymous learned acquaintance gave him a copy of a book attacking the oral law, the Torah Shebaal Peh, which was called Kol Sachal, the voice of a fool. The word, interestingly in Hebrew, Sachal, fool, can also mean Sechel, intelligence. This is a strange phenomenon of the Hebrew language, that sometimes you can have davar v'hefech, a word that means one thing and means something entirely the opposite in a different context. So Rabbi Leone, reading this book, which was an attack on traditional Judaism, wrote a response called Are Nohem, the lion roars, which was essentially a point-by-point devastation of the argument of Kol Sachal, this anonymous pamphlet that attacked traditional Judaism. That's all kind of like fascinating and not that out of keeping with 17th century writings, but centuries later, in 1852, Rabbi Isacco Reggio published a study analyzing both of those works and arguing that this anonymous book, Kol Sachal, was actually authored by Rabbi Leone himself, i.e., it was set up as kind of a straw man that then Rabbi Leone could argue against in his named pamphlet that had his, he claimed authorship of it, Ari Nohem. So, that's totally bizarre. Now, there are other theories, of course. There's a theory that Kol Sachal was actually authored by none other than Uriel da Costa, someone we've spoken about on multiple occasions, and that the Ari Nohem by Rabbi Leone was actually a legitimate response to something written by another person, but the debate continues. If Rabbi Leone had actually written this Kol Sachal, you have to wonder, why? Is it possible that he did it because he had his own hidden doubts? We know he had challenges with gambling. Did he have challenges with faith as well? That certainly makes sense, I guess, in the very cosmopolitan environment of Venice. And there were, in fact, many Jews who chose Christianity at this time, and a smaller number of Christians who chose Judaism as a result of the intermixing of the cultures. We know, for example, that he was really very conversant with Christianity and Christian doctrines and so on, something which he admits himself in Ari Nohem. He writes, "I have studied day and night the books of the heretics and unbelievers and of the exponents of other religions in order to refute the heretics." In other words, he engages in this study so you don't have to. Is it possible that he wrote both of these pamphlets as a kind of get-rich-quick scheme? Like he frequently would dedicate his books to wealthy individuals, including churchmen, in the hopes that as a result of seeing their names in the dedication page, they would then return the favor by giving a large amount of money to the author. Entirely possible, but beyond the scope of this short video. At any rate, he's a fascinating individual, a brilliant scholar who left behind a tremendous literary legacy. Now, I want to bring this back with your permission to talk a little bit about my father and about Maimonides in this particular context, because it is my father's yahrzeit. My father, it's been many years since he passed away, but I continue to think about him pretty much daily, and especially during this time of the year as I come up to the yahrzeit. I used to think that my father was unusually interested in failure. My father would often, like to read newspaper stories about businesses that failed, and he was, when I would come home with academic awards from school and things like that, he was never particularly impressed, but he loved it when I got into trouble. He used to talk about how he once went into the school for some errand or another in primary school, and he found me sitting outside the principal's office because I had done something wrong, and he was so happy to see that I would get in trouble. So I used to think my father was really interested in failure for reasons that he didn't totally understand. But with the fullness of time, I began to meditate on that, and I think what my father was really interested in was resilience. My father really recognized the value of resilience, and one can only demonstrate resilience after failure. My father was extremely dedicated to the proposition of giving people second chances. He had a clothing store, a menswear store, and he used to hire in particular, ex-convicts. There was a small jail nearby in Monteith, Ontario, and people would get out of jail and they could go to my father, who would give them some job, stocking the shelves or being a salesperson on the sales floor, things like that. He also would hire women who had children out of wedlock, which was quite a bit more scandalous in the 1960s and 70s when I was growing up, and they would be able to get jobs, working in the store in various ways. My father was really big into that. Also, he had a couple of rental properties in town. This is a really small town in Northern Ontario, and he would give people an extremely reduced rate, never enough rent to pay even the utilities and the mortgage, and sometimes he didn't even charge rent at all, because it really meant a lot to him to give people more chances in life. And so to that end, I feel especially attached to this project. That's kind of weird. I do this every year. I read Maimonides' book on repentance. We are coming up to the season of repentance, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and so I reread Maimonides, and I wrote this translation and then later a commentary, and then because this is a self-published book, it's really easy for me to simply update it every year. And so I get to spend a few months every year going over this again, going over what I thought last year and reevaluating it, and sometimes regretting it and deleting it, and sometimes adding more things. And I think that's a project that my father would have understood and approved of. So I hope that this short video, which talks a little bit about a particularly brilliant rabbi and his ongoing struggles with gambling, and my reflections on my own father and how much I am indebted to him for forming my personality and teaching me the values that I hold dear, because I also value resilience tremendously. And I hope that this short video is, as I say in Hebrew, a melitz yosher, a gute gebete in Yiddish, how would we say this in English? A positive emissary for the spirit of my father. And I hope that you should all have a successful season of repentance as well. Thank you very much for watching.